Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending where you are. It's really a great pleasure to be able to share with you now a few of our thoughts about the upcoming training, online training that we'll be doing this winter. And I'm joined with my dear friend Eric Archer, who's my teaching partner and who's been teaching and sitting next to me for 10 years now, I think. So, Eric, I'd like to introduce you and say a little something.
Yeah, well, good day, good night to all of you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I think, Biff and I are creating this online training, and yet in many ways we're charting a new path. We're synthesizing some of the work we've already done and really kind of weaving it in a new way, which these times are inviting in so many ways. And so, yeah, Biff, I thought it was helpful maybe if people heard sort of how these second and third modules came to be and how you're feeling you're weaving them together in this new hybrid online training.
Well, thank you, Eric. As many of you know, I've been teaching in yoga teacher trainings for almost 20 years. And those trainings began with what is now called the first module. And in that module, we talk about what we feel is the essence of the yin practice through the physical, through the anatomy, through the energy systems. And we also talk about that beautiful relationship of the archetypes of yin and yang. And for us, the essence of the practice lies within that relationship, and it lies within the heart of the yin archetype herself, and that's the archetype of the mother, the archetype of acceptance, of unconditional love. So that was the basis of our first module. After a number of years of teaching that, one of the institutes I was teaching for asked me to do an advanced yin training. And I agreed to do it, but as I thought, what does that really mean? For me, advancing in anatomy or more postures doesn't get to the essence of the practice necessarily. And at that time, fortunately, I had been studying with a wonderful teacher, Angeles Arian, cultural anthropologist. And she was looking at our journey through life through the archetypes of the indigenous cultures of North America and throughout the world. And specifically those archetypes of warrior, healer, teacher, and visionary. And with those archetypes come the relationship to nature, to the seasons, to the elements, to the animals. And so I felt, as I thought of this quote advanced training, I felt those archetypes expand and include all of the cosmos, on all of nature. So as we began to talk about the warrior archetype, that most yang part of ourselves, we're able to bring in the air, element of the air, and the season of winter. We're able to see it in this expanded relationship with the cosmos. And so that became the seed of our second module training. And as we taught that, as we studied those archetypes through the yin practices, we saw more and more the stories that were coming up in the yin practice, the stories that were held by the body. Those same stories that were being told by the leaves that fell in the fall and the daffodils that came up in the spring. That same story of our place within the cosmos. And as we began more and more to incorporate these archetypes into our practices, we also saw that we needed a way to listen more deeply to the stories that were coming up for us in the practice, to listen more deeply to the story of the leaves falling in the fall, to listen more deeply. And so we began to think of how we could include the study and the practice of storytelling in the yin trainings. And so I went back to almost 18 years ago when I was teaching yin yoga and storytelling workshops, and that began to enter into our training again. So we began to teach the third module, which is yin yoga and storytelling. And in that module, we look at how do we deeply listen? How do we make sense of the story of our life? and the story of the cosmos as it unfolds around us. So those became the basis of our trainings, the first module, the second module, and the third module. But now as we approach the possibility or the training that's coming up in January and February, Eric and I began to talk about what possibilities this training had to incorporate those other modules and those other trainings. So I'd like to more formally introduce you again to Eric and invite you to say something about how your background in music and poetry and art it relates to what we've been doing and what I've been talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Biff. I think, a lot of my work as a musician and poet is based around listening. As much as it might seem it's creating sound or music or words or verses, there's such a focus on listening. And as I first came to the yin practice and your module 1 training, Biff, in 2011, I remember the quality of the space, the quality of the listening, the quality of the silence, which gave that fertile soil for the poetry to really grow, for the postures to really speak in their subtle voices in so many ways that we've come to speak about and understand together in our work over the past 10 years. And so that quality of listening and my own work as a musician and then in teaching and in meditation and mindfulness and arts practices and contemplative arts is often really oriented towards cultivating that listening. How do we teach listening? Just in a very yin way, it's almost impossible to say how can we teach listening, just like how can we teach someone to go deeper into their own spiritual path. It's not something that one can do for another, and yet we can leave that door open. We can lead by example and create a space where together our group experience is actually touching on that essence. And so, with these explorations that we've had over the past 10 years together with the module 2, with the archetypes, we're exploring how we actually, whether we know it or not, in teaching capacities, in relationships, in our own lives, we live out these ancient patterns of archetypes. And the more we can come to know them and to become aware of their qualities, we're able to better embody aspects of ourselves that are manifested through archetypal personalities and actions. And then the archetypes help us start to really see that the stories that we're living out, the stories that we buy into, that we play out through our lives. In many ways, I feel storytelling is regaining that ground in our culture as more and more people from many backgrounds are speaking about storytelling towards the truth that we as humans live out stories, whether we know it or not. We understand our lives through stories, whether we think in that way or not. And so the archetypes really informing how we see and understand story, and yet starting to cultivate that listening and understand stories in our lives, informing how we see the archetypes in that process. So my focus on listening has been really focused into this yin practice that grounds the body in this soft stillness and really cultivates that space for listening. And from there, we think, how do we create this in an online format? What's the structure? So this hybrid training will not dive into the details of anatomy, and yet we'll return to the yin practice and the energetics and the emotionality of the yin practice to ground our explorations into archetypes in our own lives, into stories that we're living out, how we can listen to the stories in our bodies and in culture more through the yin practice. Each weekend we'll have the deep yin yoga practices with poetry and drumming, as well as group experiences of guided meditations and sharing stories and breakout groups and discussions and reflections on these patterns of the seasons and the archetypes, as well as, listening to old stories, whether they be myths or fairy tales and everything in between. And this experiential focus will also sort of seed into the week where each student will be on their own and have home play, not work, but play to explore sort of nature practices and the other beings that they share their little corner of the earth with, and how that informs their understanding of storytelling. always bringing it back to our own capacities to practice yin and to share it if that's part of our own path. And so this training is really seen for those who are new to yin, who really want to start to see the broader ripples that yin can, and the yin attitude and the yin archetype can make in their life, as well as the the seasoned practitioner and yin teacher who maybe has taken all three of these modules again and would like a real synthesis of how the archetypes and the storytelling meet. And so this is where sort of I'm seeing my work from the music and the listening coming through the simple power of the yin practice, and then moving out into these ways we can create spaces to better understand where that yin spirit, that yin archetype lives in our life, in our studies, and in our teaching, whatever that may look like. And so I'm curious, to hear you, Biff, maybe speak about that sort of experiential component of the workshop, and maybe just briefly, as well as how you see us linking these back into the yin practice itself, the storytelling and the archetypes, back into the essence of the yin practice and its simplicity.
Thank you. One of the things that most excites me about this training, to call it a training, is that as these modules develop, for one thing, the second module came along, and this was a yoga teacher training. But all of a sudden we were talking about what the wind taught us, and what the earth taught us, and what the seasons taught us. And then came this storytelling, which just grew out of that. But all the time, I didn't really know where it was going, frankly. I didn't know. I remember I gave a storytelling training at one point, and one of the wonderful student came up to me about the third day, and she said, "I don't see how in any way this is a yoga teacher training." And I just laughed and said, "Yeah, well, let's see." And so the wonder of it is, for me, part of it is how these things, this kind of things that came out of almost nowhere, that didn't even seem at first to fit together, but we knew there was something there, and how they've come together, and how our journey together, Eric, has made sense of these things that we had such faith in. So one of the aspects that excites me is that I'm hoping that we'll get our friends who have been through the other modules with us. And as I always say, these circles are a co-created experience. So I really don't know where this is going to go, but I want it to be a journey together. I want people to come back, and so we can talk together, we can walk together and make sense of story and archetype as they come together. I often say I feel like a little boy who's run ahead, and now I'm coming back and say, "Come on, I got something to show you." And that's the way I feel about this. I feel like you and I, Eric, and all of the wonderful teachers who have been with us through these are now saying, "Come on, let's see what this really is. Let's come together in circle and tell story and talk about archetypes and see what sense we make of it." So in that way, I feel more than ever that this is a creation that we're going to do together, you and I, and whoever else is joining us in this circle, and we're going to talk story. And so where it's going to go and how the experiential aspects are going to fit in, the exciting part for me is we'll see. Let's see. But it is a journey we're going to walk together without. There's no syllabus that this has to happen and this has to happen. We're going to go together. We're going to write a story. We're going to tell a story together over 4 weeks, and that's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it takes a certain level of trust in the practice, and returning to these core practices, not just the yin practice itself, but these other ways of how we gather in circle, even in this large digital circle, which has its upsides of distance and convenience for us to make time together. and continue to learn how these practices earn their keep in these new times where storytelling means so much more and so many different dimensions to that understanding in these past 2 or 3 years, right? Just as archetypes and the healer or the warrior, the visionary, it means something so different now than it did, say, 2 or 3 years ago, not just with the pandemic, but as our practices deepen. So that co-created journey is such a special quality of these circles. And so we invite all of you that feel called to join us, excited to see old faces and new faces. And we really invite you to join us and bring your experience together. So thank you, Biff. And we hope to see
Thank
you
you.
all details on the website and starting at the end of January. So,
And anytime you want to be in touch, we're both around. So thank you.